This is about understanding N.T. Wright and the new perspective on Paul. Tomorrow, we will do an evaluation of N.T. Wright and his new perspective. C.S. Lewis wrote a famous essay called Meditations in a Toolshed. He makes a distinction between looking along something and looking at something. You might be familiar with this essay. Lewis says the following: I was standing today in the dark toolshed. The sun was shining outside, and through the crack at the top of the door, there came a sunbeam. From where I stood, that beam of light with the specks of dust floating in it was the most striking thing in the place. Everything else was almost pitch dark. I was seeing the beam, not seeing things by it. Then I moved so that the beam fell on my eyes. Instantly, the whole previous picture vanished. I saw no toolshed, and above all, no beam. Instead, I saw, framed in the irregular cranny at the top of the door, green leaves moving on the branches of a tree outside, and beyond that, odd million miles away, the sun. Looking along the beam and looking at the beam are very different experiences. The temptation to this topic is simply to look at the new perspective with a critical eye and never look along the new perspective. But the word perspective exactly is an invitation to look along the perspective, look to see Paul in a new and fresh light. It's an invitation to see something new or something anew. That is to look along the beam of the scholars of the new perspective. As a student of the New Testament, I accepted this invitation to look along the beam. So I read thousands of pages, literally thousands of pages from New Testament scholars, the proponents of the so-called New Perspective. I read E.P. Sanders's Paul and Palestinian Judaism. I read James Dunn's The New Perspective of Paul. I read N.T. Wright's smaller works, What St. Paul Really Said, Paul in a Fresh Perspective, consulted his commentaries. Then I read many critical works on the New Perspective, like Westerholm's Perspectives, Old and New, Guy Waters' Justification and the New Perspective on Paul. I read Schreiner's evaluation, essays from Justification and Variegated Nomism, and Seifried and other authors who were critical of the New Perspective. I read John Piper's book, The Future of Justification, and N.T. Wright's response, Justification, God's Plan and Paul's Vision. And to really understand N.T. Wright's way of thinking, I carefully read through his Christian Origins and the Question of God series, the New Testament and the People of God, Jesus and the Victory of God. I haven't finished the Resurrection of the Son of God yet, but I read through and finished his massive Paul and the Faithfulness of God, that four-part, two-volume work. Simon Gathercole wrote a review on Paul and the Faithfulness of God. It's a 1,658-page long work on Paul. And he starts with this funny admission. At one point, probably about a third of the way or halfway through, I had a feeling which, unprompted, interpreted itself in words similar to those of John Newton's Amazing Grace. When we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing God's praise as when we first began. I felt at this stage at the book that having read hundreds of pages, I still had as many to go as I did when I first began. One of the chapters is over 250 pages, but I did make it all the way through to what I assume was the George Herbert allusion at the end. I'm proud to say I have also made that journey. I didn't give up. I did it with the same exhaustion. I read every page, every sentence, every footnote. Because, you make a criticism, and N.T. Wright comes back and says, but it's on page 836, footnote 3. So I read all the footnotes. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is really not to brag about this, but to show you that I made a significant effort to see what they want us to see. I wanted to look along the beam and to see if there is something to see there. Because I had seen Paul through the old perspective, and it made sense. But if there is another angle from where Paul's message opens up in a convincing, beautiful, new way, I'm ready to celebrate it. What did I see? I don't know if you are familiar with the Lieutenant Columbo series. In my childhood, I watched it. And you know who the murderer is at the very beginning. So I want to tell you who the murderer is at the beginning. Looking along the beam, I learned a lot of things. Reading N.T. Wright is a fascinating exercise. It is very interesting at many levels. He's a genius, I would say. I admire just his ability to write so much. I don't know how he does that. Like he is writing those big volumes, and in the meantime, he publishes Justification, he publishes all kinds of other works. I don't know how one does that, so I admire it. But I have to admit that I did not see the main thing, what they wanted to show me. Not just Wright, but I had the same experience with Dunn and others. When I put on the old spectacles, I saw clearly. At least that was my experience. I'm seeing clearly. When I put on the new spectacles, everything was blurred, and it didn't change with time. And it was a frustrating experience. Was it because of me? Maybe. It's possible. But I can only talk about my own experience. If you are interested in someone else's experience or objective truth, write in ChatGPT. Give me a criticism of an understanding and evaluation of N.T. Wright and the New Perspective. You will get a better material than what I'm presenting now. But I guess you are here because you want to hear someone's opinion that is a person who struggles with these issues. And that's what I can only present on. So in this talk, I will make an attempt to show you what I was supposed to see along the New Perspective. And tomorrow I will give you my reasons why I think the problem is primarily not, I hope, not with my ability to see, but with the New Perspective itself. And you can decide at the end whether I'm right or Wright is right and I'm wrong. The first thing we need to understand is that the New Perspective on Paul is based on a new perspective on Judaism. The story of the New Perspective started by a change of focus in Pauline studies. the history of religion's school understood the roots of Paul's theology as basically non-Palestinian. And it was Albert Schweitzer who moved Paul's theology back to a Jewish context, re-emphasizing the Jewishness of Paul's message. So that was the first move. William David Davis opened another door. His Paul and Rabbinic Judaism, which was published in 1948, argued for a sympathetic relationship between Pauline and Pharisaic soteriology. According to Davis, there was no fundamental soteriological disagreement between Paul and the soteriology of Pharisaic Judaism. So he essentially remained a Pharisee in his soteriology. According to Davis, there was no fundamental soteriological difference. And this is a major shift away from the pre-Second World War German theological tradition, possibly influenced by the tragedies of the Holocaust. New Testament studies could not be suspect of any form of anti-Semitism after the Holocaust. Ernst Käsemann, who had been a member of the German Confessing Church, reinforced this by emphasizing that Paul's critique of Judaism came from a Jewish context. So even the criticism comes from a Jewish context. N.T. Wright has considerable disagreements with Käsemann, but he says, if I had to choose the works of one Pauline exegete to take with me to a desert island, it would be Käsemann. It's in what St. Paul really said, page 18. Käsemann established that the background of Paul's theology is Jewish. But the real forerunner of the new perspective was Christer Stendhal. He clearly departed from the traditional view that Paul understood justification as a solution to a guilty conscience. This is very important. So he rejected the view that justification for Paul was a solution to a guilty conscience. This view is rather, in Stendhal's opinion, a retrospective projection of Luther's experience on Paul. According to Stendhal, Paul did not experience a conversion. It was simply a call. Paul's focus is not the individual, but the inclusion of the Gentiles in the people of God. So, why is Paul dealing with the question of sin in Romans 1, 2, 3? According to Stendhal, he moves from solution to plight, from solution to the problem. If the Messiah has come, then the world must be sinful. It is in light of the Messiah, the coming of the Messiah, that we see the world as sinful. Here is the new perspective in its cradle. The Jewishness of the message, solution to plight logic. Those are the two foundational cornerstones of the new perspective. But the theological revolution really started with E.P. Sanders and his book, published in 1977, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. That book changed everything. According to Sanders, Judaism was not a legalistic religion. That's one of the main ideas that are especially important for us in Sanders' book. Second Temple literature was not concerned with how an individual Jew got saved. It was concerned with how you stay in the covenant. Getting in the covenant is by grace. Staying in the covenant is by obedience. And that's what Second Temple Jewish literature is about, according to Sanders, and he called it covenantal nomism. Covenantal nomism is the structure of Second Temple literature. The problem with Judaism was simply that it wasn't Christianity. The problem wasn't that it was a law-based religion or a legalistic religion. It was that it wasn't Christianity. Sanders agreed with Stendhal that the movement is from solution to plight. Because the Messiah has come, it became a problem if you, as a Jew, didn't believe in him. Now, why is Sanders' new paradigm on Judaism so important? Because it effectively kills the parallel between Paul and Judaism on the one hand, and Luther and Roman Catholicism on the other hand. If Judaism was not a legalistic religion, then Paul's problem could not be legalism. Unlike Luther, Paul, I apologize for Germans who are not here, but Luther, okay. So unlike Luther, Paul was not fighting a legalistic works righteousness. This is how N.T. Wright summarizes this. Sanders accused Protestant exegesis of retrojecting a view of Catholic priestcraft, works righteousness, and so forth onto the Second Temple period in order that Protestantism could play the part of Luther to the fall medieval soteriology of Judaism. That is where the debate, new perspective versus revived old perspective, still sits. If Paul was not fighting Judaism as a legalistic religion, then his view of justification might have a very different focus. And this focus might have nothing to do with a guilty conscience. It might have to do more with who belongs to the covenant people after the Messiah has come. The issue is not who goes to heaven when he or she dies. Now, I want to pause here for a minute. Many scholars accepted Sanders' view on Judaism, but his new paradigm did not remain unchallenged. Just a few examples. Friedrich Avemarie, a German scholar specializing in early Judaism, acknowledged the presence of grace in early Jewish texts, but he argued that there still is a tension between divine grace and human works in these writings. The authors of this two-volume work, anthology on Second Temple Judaism and Paul, and this whole issue of the new perspective, the authors of the first volume also criticized Sanders' generalizations about Second Temple Judaism. Simon Gathercole, in his doctoral thesis, demonstrated that there is in fact an element of ultimate judgment, an eschatological judgment element in Second Temple literature. It's not just about how to get in and stay in the covenant. And that third aspect, covenant eschatological judgment, is missing from Sanders' covenantal nomism. The findings of these works can be summarized in 2 points. First, covenantal nomism was simply not the correct paradigm for much of the literature of Second Temple Judaism. So although it is a good summary for some, it's not a good summary for all. Secondly, covenantal nomism can itself be a form of legalism. In order to stay in, you have to obey the law. So there still remains a form of legalism that Paul could attack, even if covenantal nomism is the right paradigm. So it is very much possible that the Apostle Paul was fighting Jewish legalism, but the New Perspective scholars went with Sanders. And one of those scholars is James Dunn, who accepted Sanders' New Perspective on Judaism. He accepted the thesis that Judaism was not a legalistic religion. So Paul did not oppose Judaism because it was teaching legalism. Why then is Paul talking against justification by the works of the law? Because he does, clearly. Why does he speak against that, justification by works of the law? Here, Dunn follows the logic of Sanders. There is a solution, therefore, there is a problem. Solution to plight logic. What is the solution? The Messiah has come. The Messiah has come and is reconstituting the people of God by including Gentiles in it. That's the new thing. What is the problem? The problem is that the old way of belonging to the covenant people doesn't apply anymore. If you want to belong the old way, you can't stay in the covenant because the condition of staying in is now faith in the Messiah. What was the old way of belonging to the covenant people of God? Works of the law, which no longer apply. What are works of the law, according to James Dunn? The old perspective would say, works of the law is trying to earn God's favor by obeying the commandments, all the 613 commandments, or by any kind of human achievement. That's the old perspective. If you try to earn God's favor by doing things, that's works of the law. The new perspective would say, the works of the law are the boundary markers that define the people of God. So how do you belong to the people of God? By works of the law. What are the boundary markers? Well, at that time, it was mainly three things. Circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, food laws. Those were the things that marked the Jew out in a Gentile context. So that's what Paul is referring to. Works of the law are those boundary markers, circumcision, keeping the Sabbath, and food laws. According to Dunn, when Paul talks about justification by faith, he talks about belonging to the people of God. You don't need to keep the Sabbath. You don't need to circumcise your son. You only believe in the Messiah. These two ways are in conflict with each other, according to Dunn. But this conflict has nothing to do with a guilty conscience or imputation of righteousness. It has everything to do with the inclusion of Gentiles in the new covenant people of God. Enters N.T. Wright. Michael Gohin published an excellent summary of Leslie Newbigin's missionary ecclesiology titled The Church and Its Vocation. N.T. Wright wrote the foreword to this book. And at the end of the foreword, he writes a very interesting sentence. I began to realize, I'm quoting Wright, I began to realize that at my best, I have simply been thinking Leslie's thoughts after him. When I read that sentence, I thought, now I understand. Finally, I understand N.T. Wright. Having read almost everything that Newbigin ever wrote, and having read most of N.T. Wright's books on Paul, I see why N.T. Wright says that he has been simply thinking Leslie's thoughts after him. Last year, even if it's a rhetorical hyperbole, it is easy to see the striking similarities. Last year, I gave a talk on Lesslie Newbigin in this network, in this theologians network. And I mentioned that Lesslie Newbigin criticized the Western evangelical church when he returned from India. He criticized the Western evangelical church for being too individualistic. In his opinion, evangelical preaching of the gospel focused too much on the salvation of the soul of the individual. And Newbigin's emphasis was the opposite. He said that the gospel was first eschatological, then missional, then communal, and only finally individual. So that was his framework. Eschatological, missional, communal, individual. It seems to me that this is exactly what drives N.T. Wright when he is thinking Leslie's thoughts after him. For N.T. Wright, the idea that the gospel is about how individuals go to heaven after they die functions as a kind of bogeyman. It's his nightmare that Christians would think like that. Just like Newbigin, Wright wants to start with the eschatological, then missional and communal, and only then individual. He has a distaste for any approaches that start with the individual. Quote, "The gospel message far transcended the individualistic message of how to be saved, which the word gospel has come to denote in much contemporary Western Christian expression. This aversion might actually be behind his interest in developing a new perspective on Paul. But of course he would say, I'm just looking at the evidence. But maybe he would not. But it's clear to me that that's one of the driving forces behind his thinking. The old perspective, as N.T. Wright understands it, focused on how an individual sinner is justified by a just God, Luther's question. Wright wants to come to this subject from the opposite direction. The big eschatological story of God saving the world through Israel. In a sense, it's Jewish theology retold in light of the Messiah and the Spirit. Wright follows the trend set by Schweitzer and Davis. He takes Second Temple Judaism as the main framework to interpret Paul. Quote, "I take as the framework the three main elements of Second Temple Jewish theology, namely monotheism, election, and eschatology. The first move in my overall hypothesis, then, is to propose that Paul remained a thoroughly Jewish thinker." End quote. Another quote. "In other words," Wright says, "I proceed on the assumption that however we describe what happened to Paul on the road to Damascus, conversion, call, its effect was not that he rejected everything about his Jewish life and thought and invented a new scheme with or without borrowed non-Jewish elements, but that he thought through and transformed his existing Jewish worldview and theology in light of the cataclysmic revelation that the crucified Jesus had been raised from the dead. Paul rethought, reworked, and reimagined them, monotheism, election, and eschatology, around Jesus the Messiah on the one hand and the Spirit on the other. So Paul basically believed the same things as before, just rethought them in light of Messiah and Spirit. This is why Wright uses Second Temple Judaism as the main lens through which to understand Paul. And his views on Second Temple Judaism are in the camp of the Sanders revolutionaries. with one significant difference. For Sanders and Dunn, the solution plight scheme is foundational. The problem with Judaism is that it is not Christianity. Paul didn't have to convert, he was just called. Wright believes that too, but he also posits a plight solution scheme. This is not the plight solution of the old perspective, guilty conscience, justification by faith, imputation of righteousness. His plight solution scheme is not that, but a plight solution scheme that is embedded in the history of Israel. Why is the world in such a mess, and why is Israel still unredeemed? That's his plight. That's how he formulates the plight. Wright's plight solution scheme has more than one layers. The illustration he uses is Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream. But we could also use the illustration of the Matryoshka doll, those Russian dolls. One smaller inside the bigger, and the bigger and the bigger. So in Midsummer Night's Dream, there are various plots. So there is the Hermia Lysander couple in the forest, another couple, then the fairies story, and then in the fairy stories, the craftsman come in, and there are various layers in that story. That's the illustration that he uses to explain how he thinks salvation history works. The main plot, the outer story, is God's relationship to the cosmos and to humanity. God created the cosmos and humanity, but man and Satan rebelled, and the world is going to judgment. That's the outer story. The first subplot is that God plans to rescue the world through Israel. God called Abraham and gave him a land, but Israel also rebelled and failed in her mission. Therefore, she is in exile, and this is the plight specific still to Israel at the time of Paul's epistles. The second subplot within the first subplot, so the smallest doll in the Matryoshka doll, is the coming of the Messiah. His death and resurrection is the end of Israel's exile. Messiah vindicates Israel and puts the world to rights through her. So the solution to the problem of the cosmos goes through the solution to the problem of Israel. He loves to use this actential analysis, literary analytical tool, which is absolutely confusing to me. I can never really figure those out. My mind just doesn't work like that, but he loves them. So his books are filled with actential analysis. But if your mind works like that, you can see how God's solution goes through the solution to the problem of Israel. So he solves the problem of the cosmos and humanity through solving the problem of Israel. Yahweh's return to Zion is the end of Israel's exile. Belonging to Israel is the way God restores humanity and the world. And according to Wright, this is the framework for Paul's doctrine of justification. Let me say a few words about his theological method. And I will come back to what he means by justification by faith. He spends a lot of time explaining his methodology, both in New Testament and the people of God, and in Paul and the faithfulness of God. It is totally inadequate to summarize it in 3 minutes, but I simply want to highlight some aspects that I think are relevant for our overview. First, N.T. Wright's method is critical realism. That's what he calls it, critical realism. He affirms the possibility of real knowledge about the past while acknowledging that all knowledge is interpreted through worldview lenses. And that results in a more or less conservative attitude to Scripture. He insists on understanding Paul within his Jewish and Greco-Roman context rather than through later doctrinal systems like post-Reformational thinking or debates. So that's what he calls critical realism. He also uses a worldview framework because Wright emphasizes that Paul was influenced by his worldview, so we must understand him through analyzing his worldview context. Wright spends a considerable amount of time understanding the Greco-Roman, the Greek and the Roman, and the Jewish context of Paul, and gives special attention to the basic worldview structure of Second Temple Judaism. He develops his method based on analyzing worldviews through four questions. What is the story? What is the symbol? What is the praxis? And what are the questions of that context? And that would describe, those are four cornerstones that would describe a worldview. And Wright, thirdly, applies a narrative approach in order to understand Paul's theology. He rejects the timeless truths approach of classical liberalism and offers instead a narrative approach. Paul's theology, for Wright, is a reshaped Jewish narrative in light of the crucified and risen Messiah and the Holy Spirit. It's a storied worldview. In Wright's books, you find a lot of narrative criticism and those actential analyses that I showed you with the diagrams with sender, receiver, helper, opponent, and so on. Okay, I will come back to this narrative approach tomorrow. I just want to refer to what I said in relation to Leslie Newbegin last year, which is this: thinking in terms of worldview and story can be a strength, but it also runs the risk of big picture blindness. Though I find Wright's theological method intriguing and illuminating at many levels, I see most of the problems in his application of this methodology, which I will talk more about tomorrow. How does it relate to Wright's views on justification by faith? When Wright addresses the question of justification by faith, he enters a debate that had already been going on for a long time in German liberal theological context. And the debate was about whether justification for Paul was a forensic concept or a participatory concept. Forensic or participatory? Is it a legal concept? Is it a declaration? Or is it a mystical concept? An experience, kind of. Albert Schweitzer argued that justification was being in Christ a mystical concept. N.T. Wright argues that justification is neither and both, because it is essentially covenantal. It is forensic only because it is covenantal. And it is participation in the covenant, because it is primarily not about the individual. Justification means being in the covenant. It means covenant membership. That's exactly how he translates it in his works. Justification is covenant membership. Justification is a declaration that you are in the covenant. Quote, justification is the declaration of the one God on the basis of the death of Jesus. This really is my adopted child, a member of Abraham's covenant family whose sins are forgiven. Justification for Wright is not an alien righteousness imputed to us. It is a declaration about the faithfulness of the Messiah, a vindication of the Messiah, a vindication of Israel through the Messiah, and being in him in the covenant. Faith is the Messiah badge of belonging to the covenant, replacing the works of the law badge of the previous covenant. Wright explains the meaning of justification in the broader story of Israel. Israel failed in her role as a means of restoring humankind, because God's plan is to restore humankind through Abraham's children. Israel failed. This is why she is in exile. Messiah, on the other hand, was faithful. And this covenantal faithfulness of the Messiah is God's righteousness. His return to Zion to end the exile of Israel is God's faithfulness. And we are justified if we belong to this covenant. But, this is very important, we don't belong to this covenant because we are justified. This is a major difference. We are justified because we belong to the covenant. We don't belong to the covenant because we are justified. Now, why is Wright's view on justification so controversial? I will speak about this in more detail tomorrow, but let me mention a few preliminary issues. The first one, Wright often comes across as very polemical. For example, in what St. Paul really said, he says, quote, righteousness is not an object, a substance, or a gas which can be passed across the courtroom. Now, evangelicals have been hugely triggered by this. And if you read criticisms on anti-Wright, this sentence is quoted all the time. So that certainly caused a lot of trouble. In Paul and the Faithfulness of God, he writes the following sentence, quote, Paul's whole argument is about membership in the single family, sharing the same table fellowship, not primarily about the way in which sins are dealt with and the sinner rescued from them. Okay? What is not primarily? Is it only a question of emphasis? Or is it an essential distinction? That's the first problem. He's polemical, so you have to deal with it. He provokes. Second, Wright is very confusing. I sometimes wonder if he deliberately confuses us because he doesn't want to commit himself. If he comes across confusing, or if he comes across as confusing to many readers, is it because he himself is confused? We should not exclude that possibility. People think a lot and write a lot in order to find out what they really think. Maybe that's the thing with him. I'm sure he would be frustrated to hear these criticisms. But I've talked to many people who read anti-Wright, who had that experience. It's confusing. It's confusing. Third, one issue that really triggered evangelicals was his view on final justification. And it has not always been clear what he meant by that. So the final declaration that you are righteous Is it based on our life's work, or is it according to our life's work? In 2010, N.T. Wright had a debate with Tom Schreiner at the ETS meeting, Evangelical Theological Society meeting. And there, at least that's what I read, he have clarified that he meant according to, not based on. And he even said, oh, did I write based on anywhere? So maybe I was just unclear. So he seems to be saying it's not based on, it's according to. And in Paul and the Faithfulness of God, he writes the following on page 957. Justification denotes the divine declaration. The word in the right is pronounced as an act of utter grace on the basis of the Messiah's death. So he seems to have clarified himself from that accusation. Nevertheless, people have doubts. And fourthly, why is his view on justification so controversial? It is not clear how, according to Wright, being justified is based on the Messiah's death. How is it based on the Messiah's death? The relationship between the Messiah's death and our justification being declared in the right logically should be explained by some sort of imputation. But Wright seems to deny that. So there is a vagueness there that leaves the students of N.T. Wright's new perspective somewhat puzzled and confused. I will talk more about this tomorrow. So, what is the new perspective on Paul? There is not one new perspective on Paul, but many new perspectives. N.T. Wright often distinguishes his view on Paul, his perspective on Paul, from Dunn's new perspective, from Sanders' new perspective, and other new perspectives. There are terminological, exegetical, and theological differences. But there is a common core to all new perspectives. And this is how I would summarize it. First, they understand Paul as an essentially Jewish thinker. Second, they don't think Paul reacted to Jewish legalism. Third, they understand justification as belonging to the people of God. Justification is primarily an ecclesiological rather than a soteriological concept. And fourth, they reject the traditional understanding of justification as the imputation of the righteousness of Christ. So how should we evaluate this, especially N.T. Wright's contribution or N.T. Wright's version of the new perspective? I will give you my answer tomorrow.